Hey y'all, it's Stephen Van Kampen-Lewis, fresh off my trip to Brazil, and I'm kind of having a tough time actually how I want to do these videos for you. But basically, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the first couple of days as one video, and that will be what we saw when we went to Cattleya nobilior variety amaliae habitat. The next video I think will be the rupiculus laelias that we saw in various different places, in three specific places actually. And within each one of those videos we'll have the other orchids that we saw besides just the target species. And there was actually quite a few. We'll talk a little bit about the habitat in each location to sort of help better your growing abilities and sort of understand how these plants actually grow in nature. And then I think I'll do a third video where I don't actually talk a whole lot about the orchids and talk a little bit more about just some other cool things that we saw, because we covered a lot of ground, both in the air, flying between destinations, and also probably more importantly on the back roads. I mean, we just traveled these dirt roads basically in central Brazil for close to 10 days. And we went really far, like really far. Brazil is an enormous country. So one of the things actually that I want to talk about over the next couple of videos is how Brazil is not just the Amazon. The Amazon is an important part of the Brazilian geography, but Brazil is so much more than that. It's about the same size as the United States, the lower 48 of the United States. So thinking of the diversity in habitats that we have here in the United States, obviously Miami is very different than Seattle, different than Maine, different than Arizona, different than Iowa. Brazil's the same way in terms of its geography, creating very different climates. And you'll notice the climates that we go through are extraordinarily dry. That's sort of the one thing that unites them all. It was a very hot, it's wintertime there right now. So obviously their seasons are reversed compared to ours. But it's extraordinarily hot. There were heat waves going on right now. The humidity, the relative humidity in the air was 15%. So think of southern Arizona in January. That was the kind of climate that we were dealing with down there. That's what the plants deal with on a fairly regular basis. It's an El Nino year, so they're having a pretty bad drought right now. But what you're going to see in these videos is typical of any year, where this time of year in the Brazilian winter, things are very dry, lots of fires, lots of smoke, very low air humidity, and very pleasant temperatures overall. But first I want to show you a quick flyover in Google Earth, kind of showing you where we went for this leg of the trip. I'm just going to say, instead of Cattleya nobilior amaliae, I'm just going to say amaliae over and over again. So for this amaliae habitat stuff, we're in a very dry area, and well, I'll just show you more through the use of video and photography. So another thing that I want to mention is that I'm going to be talking about the habitat and some general locations, but I'm going to try and walk the fine line of giving you information about where these things grow and the conditions that they grow in, but not necessarily giving enough information so that poachers can go out and get these plants. It's worthwhile noting that the habitat, the species amaliae is actually a variety, not really a species, but its range is this sort of long, thin line along sort of the base of those tablelands that I showed to the east. But they live in a very specific altitude. So if you get much higher or much lower, you're not going to find amaliae. And this is important because these areas are really hilly, big hills, big mountains. So the topography is it's highly variable, with the amaliae only living in a very specific subsection. To make things more inconvenient for people who are trying to find these plants, like us or poachers, The general area is considered cerrado, which is this sort of scrubby vegetation that grows in very arid parts of Brazil, like where we're at. But more importantly, you have different types and subtypes of cerrado sort of butting up against each other and really utilizing different microclimates, microhabitats. So it's not like you can sort of overlay the amaliae range and say, okay, right there, we're going to find some. You have to actually know what altitude these plants are growing at, and then you have to know the exact type of vegetation that they're growing in, and the vegetation changes really rapidly. And so, and even then, the experts who we were with, and I'll talk a little bit more about in a second who exactly I was with, but the experts will go to some of these areas where there should be amaliae and there's nothing. And they don't understand why. It's a very understudied part of Brazil. It's an understudied biome. It's an understudied type of plant, really. So finding these things takes trial and error. It's extremely remote, extremely rural, so it's hard to get out there, which is good for the plants, of course. It helps reduce poaching. So, like I said, I'm going to try and walk the fine line of talking about the habitat, showing you cool pictures, but not giving enough information so that a poacher could go out and figure it out. Also, there's something that we can't see, and that's the Micro-risal associations. So what was really interesting, I'll show this towards the end of this discussion probably, is we had two tababuia trees. And tababuia, beautiful, huge tree. If you are a wood worker, you might know it as ipe. It's a very hard wood and actually sinks. It's so dense. But these trees were cut down a long time ago, and we ended up finding a couple that were very, very old, very rare, probably hundreds of years old, and they were right next to each other. One was covered in nobilior, or amaliae. One had none, zero, zilch. And some of the branches were even touching. So you can imagine over hundreds of years, there's amaliae seeds dumping down on this other tababuia, and they're not sticking. Most likely, we don't know, but most likely, there's some sort of mycorrhizal association that we can't see, where one tababuia has the correct fungus, which promotes or facilitates the germination of the amaliae seed, and the one next door, literally touching each other, doesn't have that. It's got a different set of mycorrhizae that doesn't facilitate or maybe even blocks the sprouting of the amaliae. So it's a very unique habitat. You're not going to be able to just find them just by sort of driving around. You really have to know what you're doing. You have to have guides. Its remoteness really helps the conservation. And then talking with Francisco and Mauricio, they say that the poaching has gone down now that so many plants are available. Line-bred plants are available at nurseries, so that's a great thing. Still, poaching can be a problem, is a problem, and it's a good thing that amaliae is both beautiful and very, very difficult to find. So I just wanted to talk about that for a sec before we really jump into sort of zooming in on Google Earth and then looking at photos. All right, of course, the trip took much longer than that little flight right there, but basically we started in San Antonio, Texas, and then we went over to Houston, and that's about a half an hour trip in the air from start to stop, which isn't so bad. And then the long leg of the journey is down to Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is a 9.5 hour flight, basically south to the mega city of Sao Paulo. And then once we get to Sao Paulo, we took a flight about an hour and a half north to Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil. And from there, we drove. We drove northeast, basically for the better part of a day. And I'm zooming in here to Taguatinga, because that's the type locality for amaliae. We weren't all the way that far north, but we were in this area. You can see on the right-hand part of the screen, it looks like farms, and those are tablelands. And that's like thousands of feet above the amaliae habitat. So it's a very striking landscape where you're looking up at these huge cliffs every now and then. And the habitat that we were in, as you can see in this area, is more of the lowlands where it's very scrubby habitat, but it's a real mixture of habitats. You see the dark greens and the light greens, and that's where we were at. And just to emphasize the point about the different habitat types, this is a screenshot, and you can see there's 3 or 4 different habitat types with a single road going down the middle of it. And, you know, one of those, maybe 2 of those habitat types could have nobilior. Who knows? You really have to be on the ground and know what you're looking at. All right, I've mentioned we several times, so I guess I should introduce you to the crew that we were with. First of all, of course, you know myself, and then in this photo here is Francisco Miranda, who you probably know from Miranda Orchids. He was our primary guide, and he's actually starting up his Brazilian tour industry again. And then he's there on the left, and in the white shirt is Mauricio Verbuden, and he is the owner of Orquidario Binot in Rio de Janeiro. In fact, his family has owned that business and has been selling orchids since 1847. So he's got a long history of this business. And then there in the blue shirt, sort of towards the left, is my buddy Chris Maupin. Him and I have known each other for a long time, actually over orchids. We met on Orchid Board many years ago, and then realized that we both live in Austin and we both grow the same types of orchids. So Chris, myself, and Francisco have been planning this trip to see amaliae in its habitat for a bunch of years now. And then when the plans really started to come together and it looked like we were actually going to do it, Chris's wife Megan said, "Hey, I want to go on an adventure too." So that's her there in the green shirt in the next photo. And so that was our crew for the amaliae habitat. And it was a great crew. We had a lot of fun together. Mauricio and Francisco were just insanely good at pointing out orchids in faraway trees. So having them was super cool. And then Mauricio was only able to stay with us for the amaliae part of the habitat. So in the next video about the rupestris lelias, or Cattleyas now, you won't see him anymore. And so we were driving down the back roads, the really dusty, middle of nowhere roads that looked a lot like this, all over the place. And we were specifically looking, of course, for amaliae. And Francisco knows where a lot of them are, but we were able to find a bunch of new locations as well. So the first one that we came across was in an old haunt of Francisco's. He pretty much knew where to go, and it was really helpful to see, to know where to go. And so that was where we started. And it was a bit of a slow start. The original plants that we were looking at were just not necessarily blooming, but this clump was. So that was nice. There were some buds there and a few open flowers, but it was kind of high up in the tree, so we didn't really get to see a good shot. But hey, we were super excited. We were super stoked. And just happy to be seeing these plants that we traveled so very far to check out. And here's another movie where we realized that there were actually 2 amaliae in 2 adjacent trees. So at this point, we were super excited, but Francisco was a little frustrated. He really wanted to see more. So we went down the street to his favorite place. And in fact, at the end of this video, I'll link to a video that I did with Francisco about a year ago where we discussed the amaliae habitat. And this location is exactly the same photos, the exact location where the same photos were that Francisco and I discussed in that video. And so this is sort of his honey hole, his sweet spot. He knows where the plants are, and we found a bunch. We just wandered around this super scrubby habitat, and sure enough, we found a bunch of plants in bloom, a bunch of baby plants, a bunch of adult plants, a bunch of pods, a bunch of flowers, all kinds of cool stuff. And so as we're seeing just more and more plants on these, what I thought were really small trees. I figured they'd be gigantic trees where we found these. And we did find some of those later on. And apologies for this video. I took it holding the phone, which is my camera, the wrong way. But you still get to see some cool stuff. And you see the size comparisons of these shriveled little plants compared to my hands. But notice the roots. That's one of the things that you'll notice throughout these videos is just these roots are enormous, and these roots are absolutely critical to getting these plants the water and nutrition they need to survive this incredibly dry time of year. Look, there's a little baby, there's some baby nobilior there. But you know, you're probably starting to think to yourself, boy, this habitat doesn't look anything like orchid habitat or Cattleya habitat. This is pretty harsh, and you'd be right. You know, the temperature was, 85 degrees or so, maybe even a little warmer during the day, and then the humidity was maybe 15%. So and it gets kind of chilly at night. So think of, I think I said earlier, think of southern Arizona in January, and that's the type of temperatures and conditions that this plant endures every single year. There was a broken plant, or a broken branch with a big plant on it, and that plant actually had flowers and buds and pods. And look at this one. This plant is a monster. Look how healthy that thing is. It's put out all kinds of pods. And notice how fried these things look. Like these are not the beautiful plants that you're probably expecting to see, or you see in shows or nurseries or online. This is what the real habitat looks like. These plants are exposed to full sun, and not only is this plant putting out a bunch of pods, it's got buds as well, and just tons of roots going in every direction with little baby plants all over the place. So this is a healthy population, getting fried in the sun all day, every day, still putting out flowers, still putting out pods. Super cool to see and just fascinating. And so the next type of habitat where we started seeing a lot of plants is in these open fields, just cattle fields that had clearly been fully treed at one time before, but maybe the trees have been cleared to make way for cattle, and there's these sort of remnant trees that are left behind, and they're pretty tall. And so spotting these orchids from far away was very difficult for me, but Mauricio was able to do it quite easily, and when they're in bloom, it's even easier to see. Although, as you can tell, these aren't super dark plants. The flowers aren't really popping out. It's kind of a light pink. And so seeing this from the roadside, and then being able to walk out and film them and photograph them is not easy. So you really got to have an eye for it, and I really didn't. So I'm glad that we had the experienced folks with us to see this and just hike out there and see these cool blooming flowers. So as we're spending more and more time in the habitat, we're seeing more and more flowers, including ones like this that would probably receive an AM or an Award of Merit right off the bat. Just some really amazing blooms, and just like I said, more and more of them. We're sort of getting a keener eye for where these are, and a lot of these are these are new locations for Francisco, so he's super excited. You know, we're super excited to see these. You know, sometimes they're on the ground or close to the ground. Sometimes they're way up in the trees, and kind of a little more difficult to spot. But then sometimes they're just precariously perched like this one on a teeny tiny branch that looks like it's going to break off at any moment. In fact, here's that same teeny tiny branch that didn't look like it was going to hold on for very long, but you know, I hope it does, because that's a really nice looking flower. And finally, well, not finally, but we finally came across some really spectacularly blooming plants that were sort of at eye level, and this is one of them. And you can see it's got a big cluster of buds there on the left and a big cluster of flowers there on the right. And so I was able to get really up close to it and take this selfie and ruin the photo with my big dumb face. But this was one of our favorite ones that we found, and we were so excited to see it. And to wrap up this first full day of orchid hunting, we were able to get some amazing sunset shots. You know, the entire country, unfortunately, is just on fire. There's just wildfires everywhere. Not like the big giant 200-foot tall flame walls that we get here in the western United States, but just constant grass fires everywhere. And it really made things difficult to breathe, but it certainly made for some amazing sunsets. So this was the first full day of orchid hunting that we were able to do, and the next day we came back to look for even more amaliae. And so, of course, as you can imagine, we went out to the same areas that we ended on with those amazing sunsets and just scoured the forests for additional blooming amaliae, and of course we were not disappointed. So we saw more of these amaliae in the sort of scrubby habitat that I showed, as well as the more open habitat where, you know, here's Francisco zooming in on a plant from far away with his telephoto lens. So, but, you know, I don't want to dwell too much on one species. There were other species that are worth mentioning, including catasetums. So we were seeing catasetums on trees from early on in our journeys, and you know, they're actually pretty tough to spot. They're usually in palm trees, but not always. But you know, without the leaves, they're really difficult to see. You just have to look for these little teeny shriveled bulbs clinging desperately to the side of these trees. A lot of them had seed pods, and typically when they did have seed pods, they were larger actually than the bulbs themselves, which were mostly shriveled. But this one was one that we got to see at eye level. And again, the pods are shriveled. You can see the aerial roots there, but this one had a huge pod, and actually decent looking bulbs as well. But it was really cool to see. But boy, I wish I could see what type of catasetums those were. Francisco wasn't sure. He said there's several barbatum types out there that can grow, and a few of the super deciduous ones, as you can imagine. And unfortunately, I don't recall exactly which species, but we couldn't identify them anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Next up that we got to see was Certipodium Saintledgerianum, and some really big plants. These were usually attached to palm trees, and they were big. A lot of them were in full bloom. There were some great shots that Francisco got with the drone. I'm hoping to get that video. Maybe him and I will do a chat where we do some drone fly-throughs of some of the really cool looking nobilior and Certipodium shots, and we can discuss them. But you know, again, this is just a brutal habitat, and the Certipodiums looked great. Absolutely amazing. Just the way I remember, you know, growing this species. Huge, full sun, big space hogs, and some gorgeous flowers. And the last species that's really worth noting that we encountered pretty frequently actually was Oncidium cebuletta. And as I'm going through these photos, I kind of wish I'd gotten some better pictures, but they really were just everywhere, you know, and almost in the exact same places that we would find nobilior, we would find Ceboletta. And in the places that we didn't find nobilior or amaliae, we would find Ceboletta. So it's a really common species that just seems to do pretty well in these conditions. And there's really only one plant that we saw that was blooming, so I didn't get very good pictures for some reason. I could have sworn that I got in a video, but I guess not. So this is all I got for the Ceboletta, and my apologies for not getting more. Finally, I'm just going to wrap this up with some photos from Chris Maupin. He takes some amazing shots, and he's got the telephoto lens, and even his shots on the iPhone here, Francisco, are pretty cool. So I'm really happy that he was able to share those with me, and that's about it. You know, I think for the next video, it's just going to be all about the the Rupiculus Cattleyas, formerly known as Rupiculus laelias, and talk about the different habitats that we saw in the 4 or 5 different species that we were able to check out. So see you then. Bye.